What are pre-Diluvian civilizations?
That's a really important thing to understand. And there's other terms that have been used. They essentially mean the same thing. Antediluvian, pre-Diluvian, pre-flood. Essentially, that time period has been identified geologically and through climatology as being before these events of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas is called that because it's a very disruptive time period in history that came between around 10,800 years ago and 13,000 years ago. And it's this time period of several thousand years that essentially has these incredibly disastrous events that occurred on the earth. And that's what we think of as the flood. Because ultimately, the totality of those events.
The Noah flood?
Exactly. Ultimately, the totality of that was that there was a massive flood. I think that was mostly based on tsunamis worldwide. But either way, what that means is pre-Diluvian or any of the civilizations that existed before that event.
There's no question that the Bible has spelled out a lot of strange things that happened on this planet. But as you have pointed out, there's no other history. There's no other record of things that we had where the knowledge is lost. What happened to the plans for the pyramids? Surely they had to be able to construct them architecturally with sketches or something on papyrus. Where are they?
Well, that's actually a very good point to make. When we look at papyrus and we look at paper records, what we find is that paper specifically can only last 500 to 1,000 years. And when we look at these, right, exactly. So how do you have a message be protected that can actually survive? And that really comes down to the ingenuity of the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, who realized that cuneiform, etching into stone or clay and then baking that clay into tablets, was the only way that something could survive more than 1,000 years. And I think that's why, because the Egyptians relied so heavily on papyrus and paper records and some hieroglyphs, although I think hieroglyphs were mainly done by the later dynastic pharaohs.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why some of that information has been lost.
And don't forget the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's right, and that's
clay tablets, right?
But that's paper. The Dead Sea Scrolls is paper, and thankfully it was put in these caves above the Dead Sea, which was it's a very, very dry climate. So it enables something like that to survive longer than perhaps other places.
How far back do you go?
Well, if we were to look at things like the Berosus king list that came out of Babylon, and then compare it with the Uruk list of kings and sages and the Sumerian king list, if we take those three and we try to combine them with the ancient pyramid king list that came out of the Giza Plateau, we get dates that bring us well over 50,000 years old. Some of them really point us to something more like 200,000 years old, which is totally beyond our comprehension today.
That is amazing.
But it really shows us that if we were to look at our civilization that has risen largely just within 1,000 years, if you really look at it, over the course of all the technological advancements and things that have happened since the Middle Ages and everything, really, if we look at something that's over 100,000 years old, it almost is like beyond our capability to understand.
And this history has been lost. How do we find it? How do you find it with ancient civilizations?
The first thing we have to do is we have to shed this preconditioned notion we get from doctrines we're taught in school. This idea that civilization has only come from a 6,000-year window and that everything before was nomadic hunter-gatherers and was primitive. We need to totally take that and throw it out and start over again and actually look at what the evidence around the world is telling us. And what that evidence from, whether or not it's looking at the ancient Maya or down into the pre-Inca, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the ancient Japanese, or throughout Southeast Asia, what we're seeing from all these civilizations is they say, look, there was a civilization that came long before us that taught us everything we know now, and that civilization disappeared. And that goes so much further back than we're told. So if we take megalithic evidence and look at radiocarbon dating that we're doing, and we look at the totality of all of this, we can put together a timeline and understanding to be able to recreate a show like Ancient Civilizations that actually tells this story from the evidence rather than just from these doctrines we've been taught.
Do you touch on ancient aliens, ETs?
It's obviously an area, if something like that, if we have evidence of influences that come from the stars, of course we're going to discuss it. But the focus here is does the evidence support that direction? And if it doesn't, then we don't go there. We have to be open-minded to say, what is the strongest evidence telling us from what this says? So it's an open-minded show, but it's largely evidence-driven as much as it possibly can be.